Before you had your morning coffee today, someone already boarded a plane to Pakistan to decide how much you are going to pay for gas this winter. That is not a metaphor. That is what is happening right now. Vice President JD Vance, who has long been skeptical of foreign military interventions, is flying to Islamabad to lead mediated talks with Iran in the Pakistani capital. With him are Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Two enemies, one room, 40 years of hatred, and a 54-kilometer strait that is holding the entire global economy hostage. Here's the thing. This is not just diplomacy. This is a turning point, and every crack in these negotiations hits your wallet directly. Let me show you exactly how. To understand today, you need to understand the paradox that created it. Back in February, Oman's foreign minister announced a breakthrough. Iran agreed in principle to never accumulate enriched uranium and to allow full inspections. Peace felt close. Then, on February 28th, the bombs dropped anyway. The United States and Israel launched large-scale strikes on Iran, which included the assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei. Diplomats were shaking hands while bombers were already in the air. Iran responded immediately. It launched missiles and drones at Israel and American bases across the Middle East. And then it did something that changed everything. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. The closure of the strait has been described as the largest disruption to world energy supply since the 1970s energy crisis. 40 days of war, then a ceasefire, brokered by Pakistan, and now Islamabad. But here is the brutal truth. Shipping remains at a standstill in the Strait of Hormuz, despite the ceasefire agreement between the United States and Iran, dampening hopes for a resolution to one of the worst global energy disruptions in history. More than 600 vessels, including 325 tankers, are still stranded in the Gulf due to the blockage of the strait. The ceasefire happened. The strait did not open. So what does that mean for you? The Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical energy choke points, ordinarily carries about a fifth of global oil and natural gas supplies and a third of the world's urea fertilizer exports. Think about that. One waterway, 20% of the world's oil, a third of the world's fertilizer, and right now it is effectively closed. Iran is requiring ships to obtain its permission to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is not open, said the CEO of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber. So let's be clear. The Strait of Hormuz is not open. Access is being restricted, conditioned, and controlled. Now let us talk numbers, real numbers, the kind that show up on your receipts. Oil prices already rose from $73 per barrel in late February to $103 per barrel by mid-March in response to the initial disruption. Front-month Brent is expected to remain around $125 per barrel for the near term, assuming the strait remains broadly closed. The U.S. Energy Information Administration is forecasting retail gasoline prices to peak at a monthly average of close to $4.30 per gallon in April. Diesel prices peak at more than $5.80 per gallon in April and average $4.80 per gallon across 2026. And it gets worse. In the United States, consumer prices rose 3.3% in March from a year earlier. The largest monthly jump in gas prices in 6 decades spurred that sharp spike in inflation. Now think about fertilizer. The Gulf region produces nearly half of the world's urea and 30% of ammonia, with about one-third of the world's fertilizer passing through the strait. Urea prices increased by 50% since the start of the war, as of late March 2026. The price shock and the shortage of fertilizer during the spring planting season could reduce the planting and yields of corn in the U.S., the main feedstock for American beef, poultry, and dairy, and potentially increase global food prices into 2027. And there is something almost nobody is talking about: helium. Other commodity markets to suffer supply disruption and price increases from this crisis include aluminum, fertilizer, and helium. Helium distributors are rationing deliveries as of early April. Helium is used in the production of semiconductors, MRI machines, and fiber optic cables. Less helium means less chip production. Less chip production means your next phone, your next laptop, your next car all cost more. Flight cancellations and disruptions in the UK have already begun, and Ryanair's CEO predicted summer cancellations of 5 to 10% of flights if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed. The cost of jet fuel in the US has surged by 95% since the war began. That bomb dropped far away from you, but the shrapnel is already in your bank account. So what exactly are they trying to solve in Islamabad? 5 massive deadlocks. First, the strait itself. Iran demands the right to control it. The rest of the world calls that coercion. That is not freedom of navigation. That is coercion. the ADNOC chief said. Second, nuclear enrichment. The White House has called Iran's enriched uranium a red line that will not be crossed. Iran's own plan insists on its right to enrich. 2 documents, 2 red lines, 0 overlap. Third, Lebanon. Iranian officials and Pakistani mediators said that the ceasefire includes Lebanon, and Iran said it would end the ceasefire if Israel continued its attacks. Iran's national security advisor said, "Without fully restraining America's rabid dog in Lebanon, there will be no ceasefire or negotiations, and the missiles are ready to launch." Fourth, reparations. Iran began sharing a 10-point list that included demands such as acknowledging its control over the Strait of Hormuz, reparations for war damages, and the lifting of all sanctions. Meanwhile, Trump's team arrived with their own 15-point counterproposal. Fifth, and perhaps most dangerous, trust. There simply is none. Trump tore up the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran watched diplomats negotiating while bombs were already being loaded. The tenuous temporary ceasefire appears to be on the precipice of collapsing. The chasm between Iran's public demands and those from the US and its partner Israel seems irreconcilable. Now look at what everyone else is doing while these two fight. A military planning meeting this week was attended by about 30 nations focused on reopening the strait. Britain will convene another planning meeting next week of countries aiming to restore free movement of ships through the Strait of Hormuz. A British official said the meeting will stress opposition to the idea of tolls being charged for passage through the waterway. Pakistan turned itself into the world's most important diplomatic venue almost overnight. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif described the current stage in a televised address as a make-or-break moment. That is enormous geopolitical capital. Saudi Arabia is running its pipelines at maximum capacity to bypass the strait. Saudi Arabia has activated the East-West pipeline to Yanbu at maximum capacity, around 4 to 4.5 million barrels per day of export capacity. The world is not waiting. The world is building escape routes, and those escape routes cost money, and that cost ends up in the price of everything you buy. Meanwhile, Trump himself is sending contradictory signals. He threatens to destroy Iran's infrastructure. He floats the idea of joint tolls on the strait. He calls the ceasefire a victory even as the strait remains closed. Trump said that U.S. military vessels near Iran are being prepared and reloaded with ammunition in case the peace talks in Islamabad fail. So where does this go from here? Let me give you 3 honest scenarios. Scenario 1, the Islamabad miracle. Vance and the Iranian delegation reach a framework agreement. The strait opens. Iran freezes enrichment in exchange for staged sanctions relief. The EIA now expects Brent crude oil prices to peak at $115 per barrel in the second quarter of 2026 before gradually falling. If peace arrives, that fall accelerates, markets rally, inflation drops. Vance becomes the man who ended a war. The probability of this? Not 0, but not high. Scenario 2, the frozen conflict. Both sides sign a vague communique. The strait reopens technically, but under conditions. Nuclear talks are postponed. Sanctions are partially lifted. The world lives in permanent uncertainty. Analysts maintain a risk premium on crude oil prices throughout the forecast period and expect prices to remain above pre-conflict levels, forecasting Brent crude falling below $90 per barrel only in the fourth quarter of 2026. Your energy bills stay elevated for the rest of this year. This is the most likely outcome. Scenario 3, the spiral. Nobody wants to name out loud. The talks collapse over Lebanon. Israel strikes again. Iran recloses the strait, harder this time. Historical correlations between choke point disruptions and price responses suggest that a net shortage of this magnitude will support Brent crude in the $110 to $130 per barrel range over the ensuing months. The shortage of fertilizer during the spring planting season could reduce corn yields and increase global food prices into 2027. Mortgage rates climb as central banks fight a second wave of inflation. Your grocery bill, your electricity, your gas, all of it goes higher, and it stays there. Here is the bottom line. The Islamabad talks represent the first in-person negotiations between these two adversaries since the war began, underscoring a significant shift toward diplomacy after weeks of escalatory rhetoric, military strikes, and regional tensions. But diplomacy is happening in parallel with a strait that is still, right now, effectively closed. Full restoration of flows will take months. The EIA's own modeling indicates that fuel prices will continue to rise until these variables resolve. One strait, 54 kilometers wide, 20% of the world's oil, a third of the world's fertilizer, hundreds of tankers stuck, and two men in Islamabad sitting across a table deciding what your 2026 looks like. Watch Islamabad closely. It matters more than almost anything else you will see in the news today.